Good evening from Los Angeles. I'm Chris Hayes. There was absolutely explosive testimony on Capitol Hill today. The most damning testimony so far against the President of the United States in the House impeachment investigation. Bill Taylor, the U.S. Chief of Mission to Ukraine currently, who wrote the famous smoking gun text, quote, "I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign." That man showed up before Congress today with a 15-page opening statement the Democrat says was backed up by lengthy notes and documentation. I should note, Bill Taylor went in to testify at 9:30 this morning and got out less than an hour ago. He testified under oath for nearly 10 hours. And thanks to his testimony, there is no longer any question whatsoever that President Trump's Ukraine policy was a corrupt abuse of power that did center around a quid pro quo. Before we get into all that, a quick introduction to Bill Taylor. As he says in his opening statement, he was a West Point cadet before becoming an infantry officer with the 101st Airborne Division in Vietnam. Then a career State Department official who served under both Democratic and Republican administrations in important locations through the decades, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Jerusalem, and Ukraine. In his opening statement, Taylor explains it did not take long to figure out that things were not right in Ukraine when he arrived in June to his new job. Quote, "Once I arrived in Kiev, I discovered a weird combination of encouraging, confusing, and ultimately alarming circumstances. There was an irregular, informal channel of U.S. policymaking with respect to Ukraine, one which included then Special Envoy Kurt Volker, U.S. Ambassador to the European Union Gordon Sondland, Secretary of Energy Rick Perry, and, as I subsequently learned, Mr. Giuliani. Taylor then describes meeting a month later when a staffer from the Office of Management and Budget made him realize that this irregular channel of U.S. policymaking, as he put it, was up to no good. This is the staffer for the OMB. She was from the OMB, and her boss had instructed her not to approve any additional spending of security assistance for Ukraine until further notice. All the OMB staff person said was that the directive had come from the president to the chief of staff to OMB. In an instant, I realized that one of the key pillars of our strong support for Ukraine was threatened. The irregular policy channel was running contrary to the goals of longstanding U.S. policy. Again, the threat to U.S. support for Ukraine was coming from a shadow foreign policy that was being directed personally by the President of the United States and implemented by his acting chief of staff, who also happens to be the head of OMB. Now, it is worth stopping to remember that we first learned about Bill Taylor's role in this entire affair from his text messages previously shared with Congress. And in one of those messages, he bluntly asks the Trump appointee and inaugural donor, U.S. Ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland, quote, "Are we now saying that security assistance, that's the money that was appropriated by Congress, and a White House meeting are conditioned on investigations? In other words, is there a quid pro quo at the heart of this?" And Sondland infamously responds, "Call me. Or rather, let's not make a written record of this conversation." But now, thanks to Bill Taylor's testimony, we know what they talked about on that phone call. And what they talked about undermines the core of Trump's argument that there was no quid pro quo. Taylor says this: "During that phone call," this is after the call me instruction, "Ambassador Sondland told me that President Trump had told him he wants President Zelensky to state publicly that Ukraine will investigate Burisma, the company Hunter Biden was involved with, an alleged Ukrainian interference in the 2016 U.S. election. Ambassador Sondland also told me he now recognized he had made a mistake by earlier telling the Ukrainian officials to whom he spoke that a White House meeting with President Zelensky was dependent on a public announcement of investigations. In fact," Ambassador Sondland said, "everything was dependent on such an announcement, including security assistance." He said that President Trump wanted President Zelensky in a public box by making a public statement about ordering such investigation. Sondland said that everything, including U.S. security assistance to Ukraine, was dependent on Ukraine's president publicly announcing investigations into Trump's political rival and a debunked conspiracy theory to clear Russia of meddling in the 2016 election and perhaps nonsensically implicate the DNC in hacking itself. That is a quid pro quo. Trump demanded a public announcement of an investigation, the quo, in return for a meeting and military assistance, the quid. If that was the only instance of it happening, it would be very, very bad indeed, impeachable. But it was not the only instance. Taylor describes talking to a National Security Council aide a week later who described a conversation with Trump appointee, again, Gordon Sondland, quote, according to Mr. Morrison, President Trump told Ambassador Sondland he was not asking for a quid pro quo, but President Trump did insist that President Zelensky go to a microphone and say he is opening investigations of Biden in 2016 election interference and that President Zelensky should want to do this himself. Trump was insisting the Ukrainian president publicly announce investigations into his political rival, an act which, again, isn't of itself an impeachable offense. Taylor says that Sondland spoke to Trump and cleared things up, saying, quote, President Trump said it was not a quid pro quo. They keep saying it like it's a magical invocation. Ambassador Sondland said that he had talked to President Zelensky and his assistant, Mr. Yermak, and told them that although this was not a quid pro quo, if President Zelensky did not clear things up in public, we would be at a stalemate. I understood stalemate to mean that Ukraine would not receive the much needed military assistance. So again, it was not a quid pro quo, but if President Zelensky didn't do exactly what President Trump wanted him to do, manufacture dirt in his opponent, announce it on American television, then Ukraine would not get the military aid passed by Congress and signed into law that it so desperately needed to defend itself from a Russian army occupying part of the country. Actually, there is another way to describe that kind of arrangement. It's extortion. Nice country. It would be a shame if something happened to it.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.